Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. Welcome to the 200th episode of Conversing. This is a kind of hallmark moment where we just want to pause and give thanks for the conversations that we've had up to now. It is a remarkable thing to look back and think that we've had 200 opportunities to be able to explore with different people many things that matter in the world, that matter in the church, that matter in a life of faith and matter as citizens. It's been a rich array of different people who have different angles and perspective and experience. And each one has, for me, been a great gift. I hope it has been for you. On this 200th anniversary, it's a particular joy to welcome back Anne Snyder, the editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine. Many of you will know that Comment Magazine, about 9 or 10 months ago, became a co-sponsor of Conversing, and we have partnered together in many different ways ever since that time. It's meant that I've continued to have great thanks for Anne's partnership in the work, the fundamental work that Comment Magazine is doing, and the way that it so significantly informs, but also parallels in many ways, the work that Conversing is trying to do. Today, we have the opportunity to be able to discuss with Anne a very important document which she and others on the Comment team have written. It's what they call their manifesto. We're going to have an opportunity to explain and explore together what that manifesto means, both for Comment and for the wider impact that they're seeking, which Conversing itself certainly affirms and wants to have as well. And it's so great to have you again on Conversing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure.
You know, I'm so excited about today because of the manifesto that Comment has written, you and your team. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to sort of set up a clip that we have of that manifesto being read in its 6 core principles by members of the Comment team. But I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about why this manifesto came into existence and what purpose it has for your work and beyond your own particular work.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to share about this, and Conversing as a podcast is such an embodiment of certainly the dialogical encounter and exchange dynamic of this manifesto. Yeah, I never expected in my life to write a manifesto. I am pretty anti-ideological as a principle most of the time. That doesn't mean apolitical, but Comment, I think, throughout its history, far before my time, has tried to really bring to bear 2,000 years of Christian social thought to big issues in the public square, but also to the intimate, daily, kind of common grace realities of human beings' lives. And so it felt a little surprising that over the last number of years, I was starting to sense, like, I feel like there is something that needs to be articulated here that has a little edge and perhaps almost movement building verve to it. And, you know, we can all, myself included, be cynical about movements, but I wound up deciding to rewrite a manifesto. Comment had a wonderful manifesto written by my predecessor, James K.A. Smith, philosopher at Calvin University, which we borrowed from, and I've tried to honor the inheritance of that. I think it was 4 or 5 kind of principles. We believe in institutions was one of it, but it was sort of more like a statement of convictions that seemed appropriate for his era, which was like 2012 or so through 2019. And I think as I was just feeling increasingly implicated as a publication claiming the Christian intellectual tradition and all of its internal fractiousness and actually internal diversity, but I was feeling increasingly implicated in the American context specifically, and then a little bit more lightly but broadly the Western context, with the ways in which Christianity was being used, some might say manipulated, as either a tool for Christian nationalists or Catholic integralists on the one hand, or as the very clear number one enemy for a totally secularized, you could say sort of far left antagonism on the other, as well as not really incorporated into, I think, what has many people would say sort of a disenchanted classical liberalism or technocracy, the sort of big tech world. I think as I was watching it get ignored in some of the big forces of our time and either leveraged as a cudgel on the far right or seen as an enemy on the left, I was like, surely there is a positive moral vision that can be articulated here that has integrity with history, with our own history as a tradition, though we have, like I said, there's different theological streams within ourselves. And I almost wanted to borrow the, quote, weapon, to use that word, of the reigning philosophical camps in our part of the world and say, there's a bunch of us out there that want to try to claim some territory for a vision of Christianity, both in thought and idea and philosophy, as well as in action and embodiment and witness and sacrifice, that I feel is not getting represented here, whether posited as a friend to your movement or a foe against your movement. And can we box out a little bit those that are defining us for us in some fresh language? So that's why I use the term manifesto again, though my predecessor had also used it. So it was it was in tune with the Comment tradition. But I think this has probably a little more edge to it in a highly, what feels like probably still more turbulent moment for democracy, for where we are as societies 75 or so years post a cataclysmic event of the Second World War, et cetera, and was just an attempt to say, maybe there's an unlikely group of us that could find one another, and this is some language of a set of principles that we can all get on board with and show something different in our public life at national, a little international, but also, I think, most often in a pristine way, most compellingly at local levels. So it was an attempt to articulate, frankly, the logic of a lot of my own heroes who are animated by the same Jesus I recognize in the first century to the 5th century, to the 13th century, to the 17th century, to today. And it was an attempt to articulate that in a way that would resonate with today's longings.
Well, let me invite listeners to listen now to a reading of the 6 core principles of this manifesto.
We are Christian humanists, those who believe that Jesus Christ, God become man, is the ultimate measure of what it means to be human.
We believe that every human being is created in the image of God.
Whole persons who are at once fallen, yet gloriously endowed.
Finite and dependent, yet deserving of infinite dignity.
We seek to stay true to both the wonder and to the woundedness of life this side of the veil, even as our eschatology floods us with hope.
Jesus Christ walked with us, died, resurrected, ascended,
and he will come again to make all things new.
We believe it's a time to build, that the creative imagination and the Christian imagination are mysteriously linked.
We want to begin with the yes in Christ, not our own no's.
While there is an important role for criticism baptized in a study of what is true, good, and beautiful,
it is a means to an end, the basis for wise repair and imagination, not the justification for destruction or erasure.
We are committed to keeping orthodoxy and orthopraxy married,
taking seriously our job to translate between them.
We believe in institutions, government, guilds, families, schools, universities, the church.
We recognize that in our age of individualism, institutions are often painted as the enemy. We try to change that, seeking to shape the character of today's most formative institutions while exploring what kind of reimagined social architecture might compel the next generation's trust.
We believe in the transformative power of encounter.
Encountering the iconoclastic nature of reality.
Encountering those unlike us.
Loving enemies is bedrock for Comment, hospitality, core.
We are champions of the difficult room.
We believe in the deeper truths that can be discovered when different life experiences and distinct sources of wisdom are gathered around one table.
We intentionally publish arguments with which we disagree, including those who don't hail Christ as Lord.
Not for the sake of pluralism without conviction, but because Christians have always better understood the contours and depths of their faith when crystallized through exchanges with strangers turned friends.
We believe Christianity is perpetually on the move.
There is no sacred capital.
While the audience we serve is navigating a North American context, we serve this audience from an understanding that Christianity is an intercultural, polyglot religion.
At a time of rising religious ethno-nationalism, we insist that no culture can claim to represent the true form of Christianity.
And we actively seek for our authors and partners to reflect the global reality of the church.
We believe there are different ways of knowing, that the thinker and the practitioner have equally valuable wisdoms worth airing,
That relationship and context matter for the ways in which we perceive reality. That the child with Down syndrome perceives truths that a Nobel Prize winner cannot.
And that there is a need for these myriad ways to share space and to learn how to pursue understanding, perhaps even revelation, together.
Our theory of change takes its cues from the garden, less the machine. We are personalists, not ideologues.
We follow the logic of Jesus' mustard seed.
Of yeast transforming a whole pile of dough, of the principle of contagiousness and change happening over generations.
We believe in the value of slow thought.
We are skeptical of the language of scale when it comes to growing spiritual goods.
While we wish to be savvy in unmasking the either-or reactivity of our age,
And will always call out dehumanizing trend lines.
we are fundamentally animated by the creative impulse.
By a philosophy of natality expressed through hospitality.
This feels especially important in this time between eras when nobody knows what's next, and we need one another to recalibrate, to reflect, and to shape a hopeful future.
And I think I'd like to just walk through these 6 principles because I find them each one so significant and worthy of substantial personal reflection. In fact, I would encourage listeners to perhaps listen to this podcast altogether first, and then to perhaps go back and listen to just one of the principles at a time, and then stop listening and just ponder the significance of each one of these. So the first one begins with the clause, "We are Christian humanists." The paragraph is thick, and it places front and center Jesus Christ as the one who is the measure of what being truly human means from a Christian point of view, and defines out of that then the significance of every human life, as you put it, gloriously endowed, finite, and dependent, yet deserving of infinite dignity. Why did you start here?
I started here, I think, with a very specific historical location that I believe we are in, which is a wide-ranging and sometimes at odds with one another set of threats against and confusion about what it means to be human. So I think other ages will have other fights and have had other fights, but I do believe our age, and I need to get more articulate on how this includes our relationship to the earth. This is not at the expense of non-human, but alive aspects of this moment in time, and I think the threats we all feel. But it was an attempt to plant a flag, and if we're going to fight for something, we want to fight for a conversation about what it means to be human. And sometimes in all of the millions of ways in which people experience the church, experience Christian witness in the public square, in the culture wars, the politicking around that, I often feel like this human, like deeply human place that has a love for every human being out there and a recognition that we are created in the divine image, like that fundamental contribution of Christianity to world history gets lost. And so it was an attempt to ground the Comment project, but also, as I said earlier, this is really meant to be language for a wide, eclectic array of doers and thinkers across civil society. It was an attempt to say, this is our starting point. Each human being is a soul with infinite value and worth. And we believe, we have sort of a quiet but confident conviction that there is something really special in Christ's own life. And of course, the very fact of the incarnation, God becoming man, that continues to lend kind of unrivaled power to that belief. And it has huge implications for how we understand our lives here broadly as human beings. And I think it has more specific implications for how we understand, like, why Christ even came, and therefore what we as his followers are meant to be ushering in. So it was like fundamentally putting a pin in the timeline of history and saying we're somehow in a humanization versus dehumanization fight. And we think the Christian story from its very origins has something to say. And that piece of the Trinity as Christ is, yes, fully God, but also fully man, has something to say to this. And then was also an attempt to begin to try to flesh out a word that has become a little scary to, I think, especially the evangelical world, but I think anyone post-Enlightenment who is devout and wants to think of God as fully God. That word humanism has been kind of scary. And I wanted to risk it initially, but then say, we're not losing the fact of Christ's divinity here, but we want to try to expose all of you readers to kind of a much longer conversation that has been happening about what the incarnation really means for our world and how it has changed history, and we're still walking in that changed history.
You know, I think it's significant that if you took out this first article, as one would perhaps imagine about other manifestos, if you took out the first thing that is being said, the rest of it would just crumble. I mean, if the first principle of this manifesto isn't the core, then I don't think you would be able to justify the rest of the manifesto. They might be legitimate and important things to give yourself to, but if it's not true that there is such a God and that God has come in Jesus Christ and that revelation has accompanied the Christian church's understanding of what it means to be a human being in the world, both, as you say, in our strengths and glory and in our woundedness as well, then it would be a confusion, a scramble, a radical act of just desperation to try to find some other way of giving form and meaning to the things that you go on to talk about, whether it's institutions or whether it's the place of creativity or other things, all of which we might consider good. But without this first principle, it feels as though, from Comment's point of view, it would make the rest in certain ways impossible. Is that fair to say?
Thank you for seeing that. Yes, I love that you just said that, Mark. Yes. And it was an attempt to name, like, insofar as people are looking for new labels, and we're risking this, and there was a lot of debates internally. Christian humanism, that, like, how will that look on Google? Like, but it was an attempt. So many people we know and love and respect feel ecclesially homeless, obviously politically homeless otherwise, and it was an attempt to try for not something new, actually, but to maybe re-enliven and dust off a label that could perhaps be a new canopy for a whole host of folks caught between the ancient and the emerging.
Yes, very significant. When you come to number 2, it's very interesting. It starts with the phrase, "We believe it's a time to build." Why turn there next? You began with this, in a way, grounding theological humanism, and then you move next to human action in the world. We believe it's time to build. I just think that's a fascinating and compelling move.
Yeah, well, my intellect has honestly primarily been trained by music. I'm a reader, obviously, but I was a pianist as a young person, and my favorite pieces of music have always had a surprise quickening in them. And I think I have been formed professionally by a series of intellectual worlds across right and left, in the faith world and the secular world, political philosophy, pure philosophy, that is really good at claiming the kind of, not whether you want to call it doctrinal territory, purely philosophical territory. And I think part of what I have loved about working at Comment is that we do fundamentally see ourselves as seeking, as best we can, to serve institutional leaders who are reading doers, who are thinking doers, and who are deluged, especially, I would say, over the last decade, with very erudite, very nuanced, very worthy critiques, sometimes coming out of an intellectual tradition, not always. I think sometimes coming out of worthy prophetic and or activist movements, etc. But I somehow wanted to make a link between, I think, a lot about human agency. And I think part of what we're trying to do is not let people just sit in, we believe very much in faith-seeking understanding and people trying to understand as reality as accurately and broadly as they can. But there was something about first beginning with, this is who we believe Christ is, which explains actually something about who you are, who I am. And that is a glorious mixture of divine nobility and extraordinary capacity for beauty and truth and goodness and deep precarity and fallenness and frailty. And hopefully you recognize yourself in that. And then with it, we are called into a co-creative project. We're not, in my view, just waiting for God to save the day or for us to endure this little life and whisk us to the next heavenly Thomas Kinkade painting. So I think there was just, it was almost more musical for me, like between movements and a piece. I wanted to have people recognize themselves and then from there feel invited, if not inspired, into co-participation, whether that's in a democracy, in civil society, and then, of course, in a more eschatological sense, trying to pull their oars into building the kingdom.
Right. One of the things that strikes me and invigorates, as you say, energizes the statement overall, is that you move from an affirmation of being in article or principle number 1 to really immediately taking hold of human agency that grows out of that being, that it's not just being for its own sake of walking around being in the world, but we are actually agents that are meant to deploy the significance of our being in a faithful, creative, beautiful, and sacrificial way in the world. And that's where you sum that up in part by the phrase, we want to begin with a yes in Christ, not with our own no's. I just think that combination is really powerful. And then you link it toward the end of the principle by saying we're committed to keeping orthodoxy, what we believe, and orthopraxy, what we do, married, taking seriously our job to translate between them. So it's this capturing of the consequences of principle 1. It pours out immediately into a community. It pours out in individuals. It pours out in agency again, which is actually then meant to be productive and constructive. And you do go on in the next bit and also toward this to say, of course, there's a place for criticism and critical thinking and so forth and so on. However, in the end, it's not about destruction or erasure. It's about contributing the true and good and beautiful in a messy world.
Thank you, Mark. Gosh, what an honor this is. Can you write a book about this, Manifesto? I feel very, this is very humbling to hear you, but yes, you're making it. This is hopefully the point, that it inspires this kind of dialogue with it and disagreement. I think that's part of the fun of it too.
Sure.
But thank you. It's like really fun for me to hear you put your hands in the soil of this.
Well, and this is what makes then the third principle also so appropriate and fascinating to stand inside the logic of it. So we have the grounding of it theologically in principle 1. We have the agency and activity and constructiveness of what it means to be human in the world in the second one. And then in the third principle, it starts simply with the phrase, we believe in institutions. And then you give examples, government, guilds, families, schools, universities, and the church. So by the time you get to the third principle, it's not about turning to individual agency, though you give plenty of supporting material for why individual agency would matter. But you now turn to the collective, to the common, to the communal, to what this means as we gather together in our human goodness with agency to do good in the world. And at least in theory, sometimes in practice, sometimes even often in practice, government, guilds, families, schools, universities, and the church are positive institutions. Now, as you say, there's a great deal of current sentiment that institutions are by definition destructive to the human experience. But in fact, you're turning that on its head and acknowledging that it can do that. Institutions of different kinds can do that. But on the other hand, they can actually be extraordinarily positive parts of the social architecture that helps us move forward. What more would you want to add to the principle 3?
Much to my surprise, this number 3 principle, or maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, because in some ways it's the most, I would say, boilerplate sentence. I feel it felt like the least original thing to say. This is a direct, not the whole thing, but that we believe in institutions is a direct carry on from what Comment has always said. And so that was also partly for me during my tenure, even in our age of such distrust of institution, of course, much of it legitimate, was a way to honor that and then challenge myself and my team and our authors to hold on to this as this is something we need to wrestle with, because this is not an easy time to wrestle with this, because there's, I think, I've thought about commissioning an issue actually called "Are We Past the Age of Institutions?" Though we claim this in our manifesto, just to provoke that question from a broader, like kind of wineskins perspective. But I'm just going to say this number 3 principle is the one I get the most questions about. I would say especially, this is not surprising, anyone under age 35. I always get asked, why do you believe that? Why do you believe in institutions? Why? You don't need to. They're gone. They're dead. They're bad. So that's been actually a little surprising to me that this one has felt the most controversial of our convictions, at least on its face. You said it so well, Mark, says there's very little I can add. I think part of this, again, was a desire to honor like our target reader who do lead institutions and are, whether they're colleges or police departments or hospitals or networks of hospitals or all kinds of, businesses, et cetera. Those who are finding themselves working within Congress or at a local level or whatever. And there's an attempt at real like maturity here that we are beginning with this age-old, or at least 2,000-year-old, in terms of Christ becoming man, although as Christians we believe Christ was there at the beginning of all things. So you're kind of going back to the ancient, trying to then give people agency, and then you're trying to describe whether institutional forms change, which we're very open to them changing at Comment, but that we all need forms, and we need collective forms that are ordered to transmit craft, to transmit a code, to get things done across generations, to achieve social change across generations. They may not always be the front actors. Sometimes they might be more in the base of the seedbed. But we need some structure and form, whether it's egalitarian, hierarchical, that will contribute to a sense of human progress and what we might even call a long-term redemptive process. I don't know if there's institutions in an eternal sense. I think probably not. But I think we still want to say, we want to put a flag in here because fundamentally we don't totally believe in the individual alone. And it was trying to reharness almost like a covenantal imagination. What does a covenantal imagination look like in the 21st century, where you feel a sense of debt and owing and obligation? And these are channels within which, more than you might think, say, when you're 21 years old, institutions are channels within which healthy institutions are channels within which you can actually realize your sense of agency in a way that might be more moving than you ever would have imagined just by yourself.
Right. Right. I wondered, I think this is actually the most provocative, even if it's the most boilerplate. It's boilerplate for another moment. It's provocative for this moment.
Maybe right now. Yeah.
And partly because institutions are being redefined, they're blowing up, they're being blown up. All kinds of things are happening. So it could have been that you could have said, we believe in the collective and the communal, rather than we believe in institutions. So just say a bit more about why use the institutional and, in a way, formally structural language as opposed to the communal language.
That's a great question. So let me say a couple things. One, there's both a bit of a timeless piece to this that I'll explain in a second, and then there's a specific to this moment piece to this, and some of that is covered by we are not fundamentally individualists here, though we believe in individual agency, but but a lot of some would say like I think mutual friend Yuval Levin, who by the way is to be credited with the earlier principle in terms of we believe it's a time to build. He wrote a beautiful book about that some years back.
Right.
But he would say, and I've loved when I was in his presence and he said this 6 months ago, he said, I think, I'm not too worried about America, just to take our country as an example. He's like, I think honestly, all the tumult we're experiencing, we're just having a big fight about what community means. And I was like, wow, that is such a diplomatic frame on what I'm feeling as like a major earthquake and war, quasi-civil war at times in our polarized worldviews. But I do think like Make America Great Again is a kind of community in a sense. And you can use a collective communitarian language, which I am. I sort of consider myself a bit of a communitarian. I love a lot of that language, but there's something about it that I often feel is a bit naive to human nature. And I'm not really a Calvinist, but I do believe we are frail and our loves are not always the most well-ordered. And there's something about institutions in their structured form that do sort of save us from our weaknesses. And I think what you're finding now, whether you want to call it sort of parts of the activist left or the ways in which social movements have bubbled up early on Twitter and then out into the streets in certain ideological quarters, and then what we see, say, in the MAGA movement, just to take those two examples on the U.S. side, you don't actually see, you could argue maybe new institutions are being born, but I don't see an institutional imagination. I don't see a lot of constructive skills, which institution building requires. And I frankly, a lot of the time see a lot more cult of personality, which is great at fueling, quote, community, and certainly kind of whether you want to call it tribe or, it's great at fueling a sense of the collective crowd and fueling those passions and kind of, some might even say on either side, like cult-like dynamics. But institutions are meant to breathe. They're like somehow scaffolding that are not ultimately going to kowtow to a really charismatic leader at the top or a strong man or whatever. So this was an attempt to still say we believe in structures because we don't fully trust that there's like, an angelic human being that can lead us all or a messianic figure today. It's in some ways, this is like the fundamental democratic impulse, this line, we believe in institutions. And then the only other thing I'll say very briefly is that as I've really been walking my way into Christian humanism, I still feel like such a kindergarten student of it. And there probably will be plenty of theologians and historians listening to this conversation who will be rolling their eyes at a layperson essentially leading with this. But I think I'm following my intuitions here. And I think as I've studied Christian humanism historically, which has tended to always awaken in times of felt civilizational transition or era change.
Right.
It always has 4 projects attached to it. There's a theological project going on. There's a character formation kind of virtue project. There is a civil and political economy project, and there's an aesthetic project. And this is going all the way back to like the 1st century. And you can trace this through the medieval period. You can trace this in the Renaissance. You can trace this, And specifically, I think with the 3rd one, that civil political economy project, that is fundamentally an institution building project. And as someone who's studied virtue formation, that is also tends to be an institutional project. So I think that's all kind of in the background of this number 3.
It's very, very helpful. Thank you. I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. In number 4, we move in a different direction now about the actual process, you might call it, of working out 1 through 3. And it's really about what you call, as the phrase starts, we believe in the transformative power of encountering reality, encountering those unlike us. Take us into this principle and explain why it was the outflow of the first 3.
Yeah, this second half of these 6 are I shouldn't probably say this. Mothers should not have favorite kids, right? But they're probably my favorites. Partly because they describe a mode of being, which is what I find most needed today as a way, which actually have some, you could argue, some righteous anger inside these. Like they are positive affirmations, but there are also things that we're against in these. And I think if you really read it carefully, you'll see a little battle cry.
Right.
This is... Yeah, we believe in the transformative power of encountering reality. And I actually initially had this, I think, offended some of our Eastern Orthodox colleagues and writers and friends, so I took it out. But I initially had encountering the iconoclastic nature of reality, encountering those unlike us. And that iconoclastic nature, that's something C.S. Lewis actually said about how reality itself always has the capacity to surprise us and shatter what we thought was true. And I think Lewis has a line, God is the ultimate iconoclast. But for all of our friends who have a more sacramental understanding of icons, we took that out. I think, this is multiple things happening here. First, we'll see how we do in the coming 4 years in the U.S. context. I'm saying this in 2025. But we are seeking to still bridge a lot of different worlds. And, we do believe every human being, regardless of your political perspective or worldview or whatever, is infinitely dignified and worthy of honor and listening. And so this was an attempt to hold to that and encourage that even in sort of, it's probably a little less clear how a magazine does encounter, but if you gather people around some of the ideas we're trying to put out there, conditions can be set such that people can be pleasantly surprised when, an African-American person devoted to racial reconciliation hears a white working class electrician all tatted up, like each tell their story. I've watched this over and over again. Initially, there's so much suspicion, and then underneath, they actually find like deep shared priors, often in our particular world's case because of a shared love of Christ himself and shared sort of faith and how that helps them navigate their moral compass in a complicated pluralist age. But it was trying to create space. So I would say this one in particular is an attempt to encourage our readers that we're going to publish things by those who wouldn't be able to recite the Nicene Creed with a straight face. But their questions and their ache and their longing are getting at, with integrity, are getting at either valid critiques of how the church is operating. They're getting at pain points within our kind of fractured social fabric and isolation of the age, whatever. They're getting at something. We're discerning as we publish people who don't necessarily sing like the Christian note. They're getting at something of God's design for our world, whether through ache and brokenness and what that points towards, or whether through kind of common grace working it out through their minds and lives. So this is trying to do a lot of things at once. It's like talking about how we design our convenings, and we're going to encourage you to be uncomfortable at a shared table with others you don't think you have anything in common with, but also how you kind of walk into an all truth is God's truth, freedom and trust. And I think that word encounter obviously has been a huge word in Pope Francis's pontificate. But I think even before he said it, the more I try to put myself inside the New Testament context as best I can, and what I see is a lot of this, like eyes looking at eyes, trying to figure one another out, and then choosing to pilgrim together somewhere along the way, being changed and being yoked.
I do think one of the words that came to my mind when I've been focusing on this is just the word hospitality. Now, it's different than encounter because I think even a thick understanding of hospitality can include counter, but some hospitality, maybe this is just a more anemic version, even if it's still too uncommon, is a welcome, a reception, but not necessarily an encounter. And what an encounter requires is not just a hospitality of embrace or welcome or tolerance or acceptance or extending of some kind of generosity, but actually standing close enough to actually encounter, even if not especially, those places of conflict and difference where hospitality may be assumed, let's say, for the moment, but now you're down into the work of hospitality that is about taking one another's being and doing in the world seriously enough that you're going to, as I said in a recent short that we did on conversing, enter the room listening. You're going to enter one another's room, really listening for what it is. And I think the kind of hospitality and encounter that you're describing that Comment is trying to extend is really a tremendous example of that. And I think it's going to become a feature as well has been and will be more of a feature of conversing.
Thank you.
These are all just such important words, and I, again,
Thanks.
I'm challenged and inspired by what you're describing. As we move to the fifth principle, it says this: we believe Christianity is perpetually on the move. Now, for some people, of course, that phrase is just terrifying.
Yeah, I know.
And they would say, yes, unfortunately, Christianity is on the move. In this principle, of course, you're saying something really quite positive in a number of different directions. So take us into that.
Yes. So it continues, there is no sacred capital. But while the audience we serve is navigating a North American context, we serve this audience from an understanding that Christianity is an intercultural, polyglot religion. At a time of rising religious ethno-nationalism, we insist that no culture can claim to represent the true form of Christianity, and we actively seek for our authors and partners to reflect the global reality of the church. Yeah, so this is, I would say, number 5 and really the final 3, but this one is paramount for Comment, for me in my life. I don't think I could be a Christian if I only understood it in an American context. It would feel very tinny and odd and incoherent, frankly. This is probably our most aggressive, I think it's our most aggressive claim in, again, this is specific to the times in which we live, in a moment when my observation, and I think many people's observation, is that Christianity is being used as kind of a spiritual sponsor of cultural projects. And I'm not like anti-populism, but I do think combining Christianity with Western civs specifically, which frankly, some of this also, I'm trying to distinguish Comment from peer publications like First Things, most obviously, but there are a few others I could name who, in my view, have made a gross mistake that is very much not in the tune of their founder, Richard John Neuhaus, in the last number of years, to wed kind of post-liberal questions, which I have a lot of sympathy for, with a kind of, we need to go back to our roots and civilizational roots, and there's kind of a certain sort of people that has represented the truest form of Christianity, so-called, and it very quickly becomes, I mean, in its most extreme form, it becomes outright racist. But a lot of the time, it's a little bit more of a mild blindness to all of those who actually oftentimes are living, in my view, the most joyful, generous, self-sacrificing, beatitudinal forms of the faith.
Right.
And I find them in immigrant churches. I find them in the Black church. I find them anytime I travel to the continent of Africa, other places that is sort of not the West. Mark, I don't need to tell you any of this. This is where I see the future of the faith. So I think insofar as we're straddling both concerns about democracy, we are trying to serve our society, I find a lot more hope a lot of the time outside of our society in terms of Christ-like witness and redemptive work. This was a bit of we're not going to mess with mergings of race or of a particular temporal civilization that, yes, has Christian strands in it, Judeo-Christian strands in it. Some of them are significant. We will acknowledge those. We're grateful for those. But all cultures are fallen, and we're part of another kingdom, all mixed in here. So yeah, I'm sorry to get passionate about this one, and Comment, we're I recognize we have a long way to go in fully living up to this every single day in terms of who we can attract to our pages and our podcasts and compel their own trust and empower their voices. But
and
this
what does animate for you right now in this conversation, this moment, the degree of energy that you're expressing? Because I share it, actually, and it for me, it comes out of certain concerns and fears and observations about things that I think are blind to this particular principle. But why do you have the animation that you do about it?
I think it's animating for many reasons, but I think it's animating primarily because in my own lifetime, which has involved living overseas, traveling overseas, and then in the U.S. context, primarily finding almost like remnant style. And by remnant, I mean Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit, people and communities of faith living in like as full integrity as one can this side of death, trying to follow in the way of Christ. In this country, they've tended to be Nigerian Pentecostal communities. They've tended to be Vietnamese Jesuit communities. They've tended to be Korean American Pentecostal and Presbyterian communities. They've tended to be Black churches. And then a melange of all of that, particularly in cities. And because those communities have been my exemplars, and I see them as both the future of the faith in this part of the world and onto something that respects the state but doesn't try to capture the state power, I just find it problematic that a faith that has authority still, despite however secular we've become, however many nuns there are, etc., a faith that has authority in the public's mind to a degree as a symbol. And also, actually, there is a spiritual realm that has authority in good and evil. Like, there are powers beyond what we can see. There's just something in the way in which civilizational Christianity, which seems to be awakening around the world right now, at least in the West, there's something about it that strikes at like a core evil, and that has something to do with who has got more dignity than others. It's like setting up a hierarchy of human value that seems utterly antithetical to our number one principle in this. And it just seems like deeply, deeply dangerous. I see like bad spiritual power in setting up either a race or a temporal civilization. All civilizations are fallen, all cultures are fallen, as somehow representing the real thing. Christ came for the universe and for all of history. So that requires just a very different hermeneutic than seeing through the smallness of faith, family, and flag.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you, so much of my Christian identity has been rewritten by experiences of Christian faith that are completely outside the social reality that is my fundamental location, you might say. But as my world has been exploded by various Christian friends and compatriots and fellow travelers together who come from such radically different places around the world and whose social circumstances inside the United States or outside the United States are about as unlike being a tall, white, educated male as they could be. And yet they reduce me to a deep sense of longing for who they are and for what they are about and for the authenticity of their belief. It's seamless integration in private and public life. It's capacity to suffer as well as to celebrate, or to celebrate as well as suffer. All of that changes the lens by which I see and engage the world. And when Christianity seems to be running the dangerous risk of being captured by a certain kind of ideological, political, social frame that feels as though it's really making itself primary simply by its Napoleonic capacity for self-crowning, that is a very dangerous thing. So the animation of Principle 5 makes total sense to me. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing with it. It's really encouraging to meet people who do.
Number 6 begins by saying, we believe there are different ways of knowing, that the thinker and the practitioner have equally valuable wisdoms worth airing, that relationship and context matter for the ways in which we perceive reality, that the child with Down syndrome perceives truths that a Nobel Prize winner cannot. And it goes on from there. What a rich and fascinating concluding principles. So tell us how this comes where it does in number 6 and what it adds essentially to what has already been said.
I mean, I hope this is all consistent with the whole thing. I will be honest, this is my absolute favorite principle, and I have learned this from the bottom up. It's hard to describe in words, but I think we all probably can call to mind. I mean, ideally, if they're, people of faith and churchgoers listening, ideally, this happens in a congregational setting, in a church setting, probably one of the last few institutions that allows this to happen. But I think it can also happen cross-vocationally. The delight, again, this gets to the power of encounter as well, that the delight that occurs when people stay long together with very different cognitions. Like, there's so many different kinds of diversity in the world, and all of it is worthy of, honoring. But there's something about the way in which each of us accesses what is real, distinct from one another, that I think is like this glorious piece of what it is to be made in God's image. And the infinity of that image, I perceive the world very differently than a painter does, than someone who is a full-time chef, than a musician. And then most movingly to me, I don't know what this is, every time I'm ever in a church service and there is a child with Down syndrome or someone with a severe stutter or any kind of capacity like that, or disability, if they read scripture or they're reading anything aloud, I always just find myself crying, moved there's something piercing through that is like these paradox of
yes,
this, the weak made strong, et cetera, that I really can't articulate I can't articulate in the English language. But this is a little Comment's mischief. When we do gather people, we try to bring people together who initially are not all the same kind of expertise, and they tend to speak in the jargon of their guild, et cetera. And so this was both kind of a theory of change thing that we, of course, there's a lot of stuff around cross-disciplinary, and that does happen in the academy to a degree, but we want to get beyond just a certain kind of guild formed cognition and more into how do doers and public intellectuals converse together and enrich one another instead of being at loggerheads? And how could we set the conditions for that, both in our pages and then more in gathering? But yeah, I think, there's something in here also some might see sneaking in, frankly, a bit of a deep, value of all life here. I mean, there are political implications to what we're saying, and that's intentional. But this was a way of bringing full circle the very first principle, which is that all human beings have infinite value and worth, all manifest the image of God. And that happens through a delightful, truly infinite array of means. And when those come into contact with one another, something really holy can occur.
Right.
I think it's how God designed us to be in communion.
Right. Well, when I reached this the first time I read it, it felt like a huge exclamation point to me. And the reason is, I think, because of what you're saying. If you begin with the affirmation of what it means to be a human being because of who God has shown himself to be through Jesus Christ, and you then walk through the 2 through 5 principles that have been outlined, then you come to, in a way, something that could either be actually its own number 1, or it could be its own number 6, or it could be embedded in 2 through 5, because everything else really hinges and turns on what it is that we claim to know, and why ever it is that we claim to know it is always present in our whole human experience every day, whether we ever use that language or not. We're functioning out of a confidence in some cases, maybe an anxiety in other cases, about what we think we know and or don't know. And to have this here feels as though it in a way, like a flywheel, it sends you back to number 1 and sends you back through 2 through 5. And it motivates like an engine, this ongoing work of knowing that every one of us is engaged every moment of every day. Even if we don't look at our knowing, we are functioning out of some places by which we have come to have confidence or uncertainty about what we know. And so for this to be here felt to me as though it was a kind of capstone, because it holds the engine that actually drives all the other things. And then to realize the diversity of knowing, which it so beautifully underscores, and the perceptions that so many different people with so many different kinds of knowing expresses it's just extraordinarily powerful. And your example of a person with Down syndrome, for example, for me, it's been someone primarily with cerebral palsy. And throughout the whole of my life, there have always been at least one or more people with cerebral palsy who have been present in my life. And the most significant one of those by far is a young man I met when he was 14 or 15 years old who just died last week at 44.
Oh gosh, Mark, I'm sorry.
Dramatic disability, but it became evident over time through all the way that scientists could explore this, that he was a person of truly exceptional intelligence on any register. Just like some of the reports that I've written put him in the top 1%.
Yeah.
And yet here he is living in this body completely racked by this disease that gives him the appearance that he may not know anything. But in actual fact, he was able briefly for a period of time in his teens to write some essays, which I would love to share with you, Anne. To write some essays that give a window into his understanding and knowing of the world that since I first encountered it 28 years ago has really been like a fugue line through my life. And a week from now, approximately, I'll be doing his memorial service, which is really going to be a celebration of seeing him when he was largely unseen or unseeable. Or seen or unseeable in part. Whereas this universe of a human being that he was present if you had the opportunity to be able to come to discover that. But it's like, as this paragraph captures and points to so beautifully, I would give up all kinds of other sorts of knowing just to know as Dustin has known the world and known God in a way that is transformative to me.
Yes. That was so beautifully put. I think, we're in a moment where, rightly put, a lot of people are asking, what is reality?
Right.
And something about this, at least in the context of the other principles and in the context of our own belief of the arc of history and hopefully some moral coherence in all this, eschatological coherence, that it was an attempt to crack back open the door to say, we may not all be able to see or feel or certainly experience the same reality, but that may not be something to be so scared of entirely. I think what we need, again, is, and this wraps it all together, is a little more patience with encounter, a little more, all the other things that precede this. And actually, how could we see our different ways of knowing as a great gift?
Right. And as we come to the end of our conversation, I just want to say to all of our listeners, the reason why we have spent this time together having this conversation today is that I know that for so many people, there's just deep discouragement, there's confusion, there's a sense of fatigue that is overwhelming, a sense of trying to get your bearings in what feels like an ocean of crises and challenges and difficulties. And I think that there's embedded in this beautiful manifesto something that for me is the source of enormous hope. And it distills in 6 affirmations elements of this larger manifesto, which includes more than just these 6 statements. But in these 6 principles, it distills things that for me hold up the primary things in a way that is just deeply motivating to me. And when I think about the work of Comment, it's what I see Comment producing. When I think about Conversing, it's at least the spirit of what Conversing is trying also to contribute to, which is why I'm so grateful for the partnership between Comment and Conversing. But I think it also names what many people are just so deeply hungry for. And this is where the gift of this felt so important to me that I couldn't wait when I first read it to have an opportunity for this conversation. And so thank you so much for joining us and for the ongoing outworking of this in real time, which Comment is seeking to do and Conversing is seeking to do, and many people listening to this will be seeking to do in all kinds of different contexts.
Yeah.
But if we hold on to these 6 things, I think we're holding on to what is good and beautiful and true in ways that can truly be transformative. So thank you for being a partner, and thank you for being today's guest.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you. An honor.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.